Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. This is probably the last episode of Wider View you will hear, at least for a while. After this week, I will take the rest of the summer off. But before doing that, I want to reflect on the key events of the last few weeks. I'll begin by quoting the great journalist and filmmaker Andrei Vilcek. The death of Mr. George Floyd is a symbol, really, as black people get murdered in the most despicable way almost every day. From January 2015 to date, for example, 1,250 African American citizens have been shot and killed by the police in our democratic USA. In the country of freedom, 2.3 million human beings are rotting away alive in the increasingly privatized prisons. The U.S. prisoner rate is the highest in the world. Holding people behind bars is big business, and minorities form a disproportionately high percentage of the detainees. End quote. After 3 months of sheltering in our homes in order to curtail the spread of the coronavirus, Americans are gathering in large numbers in the streets of every major city and many smaller cities and towns to protest the murder of yet another African American citizen by our militarized police. This is possibly the largest spontaneous outcry of citizens in recent years, but it is, so far, without a leader or a set of demands other than asking for the police violence to stop. Some of the protests have also become violent, and that's given rise to many different responses. Blame, of course, has been laid at the feet of Antifa, the Boogaloo Boys, or as our president has characterized them, thugs, looters, and losers. The Democrats, having spent much of the last few decades focusing on identity politics, are split between those who feel that violence is justified by generations of racist violence against people of color, and those who fully support the right of people to protest, just as long as they don't destroy property. We now see businesses, even large corporations, announcing their solidarity with the demonstrators. I received an email from Citibank today informing me, quote, "We hope you know that Citi is an organization that champions equality, diversity, and inclusion," end quote. Given the history of Citibank, that's laughable. I got an email from Uber telling me how committed they are to driving lasting change through criminal justice reform and how they're committed to creating a community that treats everyone equally. I assume treating their drivers like real employees doesn't count. While you may welcome such gestures, and they're certainly better than nothing, we need to recognize that if corporate capitalists support something, it's because it either profits them or enriches their shareholders, or at least doesn't challenge their profit. If you ask them to pay their fair share of taxes to build infrastructure for our cities, they would bring their lobbyists out in force to make sure Congress rejected it. If you required them to bargain collectively with their employees and pay them a living wage, you could expect a lot of resistance. Racial justice, while very important and very overdue, does not threaten the global capitalist system, and that system is what is really responsible for the precarious lives so many Americans, particularly Americans of color, lead. That system is why most families didn't have $400 in the bank for emergencies before the pandemic kicked them out of a job. That system is responsible for the fact that we are the only developed nation that doesn't provide health care to all its citizens with no charge at the point of service. That system is why so many young people in this country are saddled with a huge debt burden after college, often without actually receiving a decent education. And that global capitalist system is the reason why the U.S. government spends over $1 trillion per year on the military and is at war or threatening war against multiple nations all the time. That system is responsible for the trillions of dollars that have been pumped into Wall Street to keep stock prices high, even though millions of Americans are out of work and face imminent foreclosure on their homes and cars. Here's former Green Party vice presidential candidate Ajamu Baraka writing in the Black Alliance for Peace newsletter, and I quote, "So, we say, justice for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, for our political prisoners, for the super-exploited black and brown working class, for oppressed indigenous nations, and for the millions subjected to U.S. warmongering, sanctions, and criminality. We say this to shift the focus from the individualization of this week's rebellion back to the objective structures of white supremacist global colonial capitalist domination." End quote. In that article, Ajamu Baraka quoted an earlier Facebook post of his. "The enemy knows how to quickly adapt in the ideological struggle. 1. Undermine the First, undermine the emerging unity with white agitator propaganda. Second, follow up with declaration against something called Antifa as a terrorist group. Third, instruct the police to join demonstrations and express solidarity. 4, release statements from police chiefs and others pushing the bad apples theme. And most important, 5th, keep the focus on the individual and call for justice for that individual to avoid attention on the systemic and enduring elements of black and brown colonized oppression." End quote. Baraka's Black Alliance for Peace article concludes, "Two things must happen fairly quickly. On the ideological level, a shift must occur away from the focus on individual justice for Floyd, back to a critique and opposition to the ongoing structural violence of the system. It's clear that the state is unwilling and unable to protect the fundamental human rights of the people. The demand for people-centered human rights provides a broad, radical framework for advancing concrete demands that can unite broad sectors of the population. Secondly, and most importantly, the theme and message around the importance of organization must be aggressively advanced. Mass mobilizations have a place, but developing the organizational forms that will build and sustain the power necessary to bring about radical fundamental change is the primary challenge and historic task." End quote. Ajamu Baraka is absolutely correct there. If the current protests are to achieve an appropriate and lasting result, they need to expand beyond simply fighting racism on the individual level to attacking the system that oppresses all poor Americans. The key question is whether the energy and anger of these demonstrations will remain focused entirely on eliminating the bad apples in police departments, or whether they will morph into a demand for radical change. Regardless of whether that movement metamorphosis occurs, the damage to U.S. prestige may be fatal. Bernard, the voice of the Moon of Alabama blog, wrote this week, quote, "The protests will soon die down, but the divide within the U.S. public will only deepen. Trump voters will call themselves the Trump Army and wear the camouflage Keep America Great hat to fight the liberal mob, and liberals will respond with pro-black gestures but without follow-up actions. Writing Black Lives Matter on a DC street or changing the name of a place does nothing for blacks when the police can continue as before. Racist attacks in the U.S. will only increase. What has changed is the public image of the U.S. throughout the world. Years of careful branding and propaganda have been put to waste. No U.S. ambassador can now express concerns about police violence in a foreign country without being laughed at. The U.S. has been put on crisis watch and, in my estimate, will stay there for quite a while. The current economic situation makes it certain that the Civil War continues, and the next round is likely to be more violent. The empire is sinking in front of our eyes." End quote. When the State Department complains about China's repression of the protesters in Hong Kong, they can easily shift the narrative. As Mint Press News reports, Chinese authorities have been roundly condemned by Western governments and human rights organizations for their excessive use of force, using tear gas and rubber bullets that have harmed protesters. However, in more than a year of near constant conflict, Hong Kong authorities have not killed anyone. In contrast, at least 17 people have been killed protesting in the United States. The violence and property damage caused by U.S.-backed pro-colonial protesters in Hong Kong is far worse than that occurring here in the United States. The successful revolutions elsewhere in the world that were sparked by allegedly spontaneous demonstrations have usually involved training, support, and covert help from the United States. Ukraine, Syria, and Georgia are recent examples. But the demonstrators here in the United States are getting no training or funding from the National Endowment for the Democracy. And if the CIA has infiltrated them, you can bet they aren't doing so to help them overthrow the regime. There's an old Russian joke: why has there never been a coup in the United States? Answer: because there's no American embassy there. There is potentially a flip side to all of this. Here's Ajamu Baraka speaking recently on Telesur TV.
Well, one thing that's significant and very, very important is the international solidarity that's being expressed worldwide. I think people are recognizing that the struggle within the U.S. is a struggle that impacts everyone because, of course, we are at the center of empire. And it's also important, too, that people understand, and I think that they do, that this fight is not just a fight for justice for George Floyd, but it is a fight that is bringing attention to the ongoing human rights crisis within the U.S. And the ongoing war being waged against Black and brown working class people in this country. So the connections between the struggles in the U.S. And the solidarity of people around the world does signal a very, very important departure, and one that does harken back to the days of the 1960s, when the struggles of African people in the U.S. Was the centerpiece of resistance for many. People are beginning to make the pivot away from the notion of George Floyd being a one-off situation to one that is can only be understood within the context of the role of the police force as the cutting edge of enforcement for the capitalist state. They are also making the connection between the death of George Floyd and the hundreds of African American people who are dying every day from capitalism. And so people are making those connections and understanding that even after the George Floyd situation is resolved, that the deaths and the structural violence that people are exposed to, as long as we have capitalism, will continue. So those connections are being made. And that's why this fight in the U.S. is not going away anytime soon.
To give you an idea how these protests are being perceived elsewhere, I thought I would include a question that was posed by the interviewer from Telesur, a South American network, along with Ajamu Baraka's response.
So, speaking of Black Alliance for Peace, you're calling for the UN to address this human rights crisis in the United States. Tell us about that, and what would it take to hear from international bodies and foreign governments on the deterioration of democracy in the United States as the regime is killing its own people, targeting journalists, and mobilizing militarized forces to repress citizens?
Well, one reason why we made that appeal was the comment made by President Trump, where he basically said that the U.S. state was prepared to use lethal force against African Americans and others who may be engaged in lawful activities. And so we called on the UN to, in fact, intervene to protect the human rights of people in the U.S. We know that the U.S. has used this weapon of human rights as a justification for interventions, unilateral interventions. But we know that one of the central elements of the United Nations mission is to protect human rights. So we say if there's going to be a scrutiny and intervention in countries around the world, that same standard should be applied for the United States of America, where we have this ongoing and deepening human rights crisis. We made that call, but we recognize that in the end, it is only the organized people of this country that are going to be able to objectively protect our human rights. We understand we have to fight for our human rights, and we are preparing to do just that.
So, the U.S. capitalist class is responsible for generations of flagrant looting upon which the country was founded. What do you say to the media and those operatives who have tagged working class citizens as looters and violent rioters while most of us are getting ransacked?
Well, we say that basically the real looting is taking place by the capitalist class. And one of the most brazen examples of that was the legislation that was meant to bail out the economy, but what really ended up being a bailout for the bankers and the corporations to the tune of billions of dollars. So that is the significant looting that we're concerned with. We're not concerned with some minor looting of some stores or some minor property damage in the course of people involved in struggle. And we are hoping that people don't get too confused by the attempts by the corporate press to focus on the looting in order to try to demoralize the movement and confuse people in terms of what the objectives are in this country. So we're not concerned about looting. We understand what we need to do to build a movement, and we understand that we have the values and the prestige to engage in a struggle that will win millions to our side.
Well, let's hope Ajamu Baraka is right and that millions the world over will join with the demonstrators to demand an end to the global capitalist, colonialist, imperial government regime that is killing and brutalizing millions worldwide. For the most part, the people marching in our cities are not the professional activists who show up for every march and rally. Many of them are marching in the streets for the first time because the blatant racism in this nation has become intolerable. So far, there are no leaders, and the demands seem to be localized and focused on the police and civic officials. While the Republicans and the right-wing media will try to seize this opportunity to clamp down on dissent and increase repression, there will be a concerted effort by the corporate media and the Democrats to keep the demonstrators tightly focused on racism as a problem of individuals or of local governance. It's essential that neither of those groups achieve its objectives. We must preserve our right to dissent and our right to be free of police surveillance and repression. while we transform these marches into a strong movement for radical change to the globalized capitalist system that enriches the very few at the expense of the vast majority, that steals the resources and snuffs out the lives of people around the world in order to maintain the lifestyle of the West's rich and famous. This movement may be our last hope. Certainly our political system doesn't seem able to provide that hope. To wind things up, here is Margaret Kimberley, who has been a guest here on Wider View a number of times, speaking on Consortium News Live, Friday, June 5th.
There has been a complete loss of legitimacy by all of these people, and the system did it to itself, so that when there is a crisis like this, and the precipitating event, of course, was the killing of George Floyd, which was preceded by, we saw another killing. It wasn't cops, it was vigilantes, Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. We saw him die. We saw Floyd die. There are other things going on. We have more than 30 million people newly unemployed in the last few months with nowhere to turn, with the political party that lives off its old reputation and claims to be the party of working people doing absolutely nothing for them. Another primary rigged where Sanders, who capitulated sadly, where those people who wanted to see some of the things he was talking about being told, you're not getting it. And not only are you not getting it, we are giving you the most right-wing Democrat who was running, one of the worst people for a variety of reasons. So here we are now in a situation, and I want to say something about the word violence. I think of that as being a crime against a human being. Property crimes to me are not, I don't think of those as violence. I don't think it was coincidence that the killer cop in Minneapolis was arrested the night after a precinct was burned. I believe that heightened their anxiety. They knew that the old method of, first they said, well, we fired him, and that was supposed to calm everybody down, but it did calm everybody down. And then when they arrested the one cop, that didn't calm everybody down. So now then they arrested all of them and charged all of them and increased the charges against them. That has not dissipated the actions in the streets. And most of the violence has come from the cops. Here in New York, it is the police that have attacked people. They have assaulted, for some reason, they take people's bicycles. I don't know why they're focusing on bicycles. Hopefully someone can explain that to me. They beat people up, they snatch their bikes. The curfew. This is our third night of curfew in New York. 2 nights ago, there were thousands of people on the Manhattan Bridge connecting downtown Brooklyn to lower Manhattan. And the police blocked both ends of the bridge in an effort to intimidate people, but none of it is working. People are angry. They are angry about these police murders. They're angry about their own situations. They're angry that the duopoly in this country keeps telling people, no, you can't have what you want, especially people, what passes for a left in this country are constantly told, you can't ask for anything. If you don't vote for Joe Biden, who's a train wreck for a variety of reasons, then it's your fault that Trump wins. And we get Joe Biden going to a black church, talking about the police shooting people in the leg, and then he takes a knee, and that's what we're told is our salvation. So I think this has some staying power.
I agree, Margaret. These demonstrations have some staying power. We must acknowledge also that this regime in power in Washington and the oligarchs of the 0.001% who control them are not going to give up quietly. We will be seeing even more attempts at repression. Already we have the social media giants banning voices, particularly foreign press and radical voices here in the U.S., in the name of saving us from fake news. With the economic slowdown caused by the coronavirus threatening to collapse into a full-blown depression, you'll see the federal government using the desperate need for financial aid to coerce states into conformity with the dictates of the Trump regime. There will be little reporting on this in the press, since what little is left of our news media is controlled by a few very large corporations and vulture capitalist firms. It could be a very tough summer. This will be the last episode of Wider View Radio until at least September. I need a break to recharge my batteries, and I hope you've enjoyed these broadcasts and perhaps learned a few things. The archive of past programs will remain at widerviewradio.podbean.com, so you can go back and listen to any you may have missed. If you enjoy hearing programs like this one, please consider becoming a volunteer or donating to your local community radio station. Community radio is one of the few independent sources of news and analysis left in the sea of corporate media in the United States. Find out how you can help your local station and the cause of independent media by contacting them. As always, the views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of this radio station. Our aim is to provoke you to think outside the box and to question the narratives you hear from the mainstream media and our national leaders. I hope we have succeeded. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening to Wider View.